Welcome. May the grace and the peace of the Lord be with you. Today I will be reading from the book, Kalimatullah, the common word between us and you, Reforming Islam to Honor Prophet Muhammad by Following the Sunnah of the Messiah, by Archie. Continuing in Chapter 1, Word of God, Word of Man. Part 2, a brief review of the Arab Conquest. The Prophet Muhammad died unexpectedly in Yathrib in June 632. The Prophet had a close group of companions who were among the most faithful, but they had not foreseen an ummah, community of believers, without Muhammad. After some conflict, a leader was accepted by the largest faction. Others either pledged allegiance or were recognized as threatening rivals to be assassinated in the dead of night or confronted on the battlefield. As rivals were killed or exiled, their followers submitted to their conqueror, further increasing the military forces of the caliph. The wars of Ridda, apostasy, settled the leadership of the Ummah, then expanded with raids of neighboring pagan Arab provinces across the Arabian Peninsula. Conversion to Islam, at this time, tended to mean recruitment into the conquering army, rather than an acceptance of a new religion. In this sense, the offer given to a defeated enemy to convert, or rather to submit or die, was nothing unusual. Alexander the Great would have given similar terms to the Persians. Thus, a united Arab force then turned northward to invade neighboring Syria and Iraq, then on to Palestine and Egypt. The territory conquered was rich and vast, and such new power overwhelming to manage. Arab leaders, tribal warlords, each assumed power over conquered provinces and often squabbling with each other, assassinating faction leaders including caliphs to secure regional power and affirm allegiances. Within less than 30 years of this conquest, merged with fitna, civil wars, emerged Muawiyah, governor of the province of Syria, in consolidating power in Egypt, the Levant and Mesopotamia with Syria. He declared himself caliph in 661, beginning the first Arab dynasty of the Umayyad clan lasting 89 years, 661–750. The regions of South and Central Arabia, Yemen and Persia remained in the control of various tribal Arab warlords, but Muawiyah would hold off his rivals at the borders of his territory and establish himself and his dynasty as the rightful successors of Muhammad. The Arab conquerors had taken control over the Christian cities and provinces, but they were mostly illiterate small-town Arabs from the remote Hijazi region, or neighboring Arab regions, or other illiterate desert-dwelling Bedouin. So, to stabilize rule over large populous city-states, they had to heavily rely on the educated class of dhimmi, Christians and Jews who had been running the cities previously, to fulfill all the administrative functions of government and trade. The Arab Mohammedans, they did not identify as Muslims yet, were not an ummah of Islamic scholars. They understood their religion to be monotheist. They acknowledged Abraham as their father, Moses as the great prophet, and Jesus as Messiah. So to most, Arabs, Egyptians, and Syriacs alike, their religion was of little distinction at first. The dhimmi were required to pay the jizya, a subjugation tax for being the conquered peoples. When Muawiyah made it clear that monotheists who acknowledged Muhammad were exempt from the jizya, many of the local non-pious Christians and Jews preferred to pledge an allegiance to Muhammad, the prophet of the Arabs, thereby getting the tax exemption. Arab migration streamed out of the peninsula and into the new territories, living off the jizya paid by the dhimmi. Not until the second and third generations were the ruling class Arabs sufficiently civilized to establish an Islamic cultural identity. The new generation, sons and grandsons of the Bedouin, were educated in the universities of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. They were not like their fathers. They were not illiterate small-town Arabs and desert Bedouin. They were the aristocracy, the overlords of a people of the book. In each region, the local native languages were the languages of business and governing administration, and Greek or Latin were the international languages of trade negotiations. The young Muslim generation felt entitled, appointed by Allah as superior to the Christians that they ruled, but they were not accomplished. The dhimmi were inferior by definition, but they still had the native advantage. By the third decade of the Umayyad Caliphate, they had recognized a way to resolve this dilemma and turn the tables. Abd al-Malik, R. 685-705, began the transition of the official language of government to Arabic. Immediately, the new educated generation assumed key roles in society. This was a successful political move. He was also the first to mint Arabic coinage, replacing the Greek and Persian currencies in 690, providing the first historical evidence for the title Rasulullah, Messenger of God. Abd al-Malik also commissioned the building of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed in 692, marking the earliest appearance of the term Islam. With these changes in place, an Islamic pride surfaced at the popular level in the early 8th century. Hence, the first historical record of the Islamic period was 58 years after the death of the Prophet. With the exception of the Qur'an itself, no Muslim text can be dated earlier than about AD 800. There is no reliable evidence that Yathrib was ever a capital city of an empire. In fact, Yathrib was not more than a village. The seats of power were in Syria and Iraq. The first documented caliphate, the Umayyads, ruled from Damascus. If the pious followers of Muhammad were followers of a prophet of peace, they were probably not the driving force of a conquest of the lands of the people who had the scriptures of the one true God. They probably remained in Yathrib, praying for peace. But the Umayyads recognized the value of religion as a political tool to further advance an empire. So the majority living in the first century of Islam only knew that they had the true monotheistic religion and that they were blessed because of the Sunnah of the Prophet, who brought them out of the age of ignorance to acquire some of the greatest cities of learning in the medieval age. In 749, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa declared open rebellion against the Umayyad rulers, waging savage attacks against the regime. Legends that portrayed the Sunnah of the Prophet as a fearless warrior, reaping booty and taking women captives was effective, as was Allah's support to destroy the hypocrites. All such narrations gave Abu al-Abbas justification for savagery and insurrection, as he imitated the best of believers and recruited many young men to follow him into glory. According to the tradition, the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty were not known for their religious devotions, but often seen as not more than a tyrannical dictatorship. Abu al-Abbas would motivate support by criticizing the irreligious behaviors of the Umayyads and contrast their rule with the visions of Muhammad's greatness and the loyalty and devotion of his companions. Stories were told to account for the great success of the Arab Conquest in what became known as the Golden Age of the Blessings of Allah, 632-661. The first four caliphs were referred to as the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, reciting narrations of their loyalty to Allah and His Messenger, and how these small tribal peoples were blessed to inherit the great lands of the Middle East because they fully submitted to Muhammad as he brought God's justice to the lands. According to this tradition, the Rashidun had been from among Muhammad's closest companions. They had memorized the Qur'an and imitated the Prophet in all aspects of life. They ensured the Qur'an was preserved and were the example to the faithful. They followed the perfect example of Muhammad, who was himself a skillful raider and fearless warlord who ruled Yathrib, eliminated his enemies with vengeance, and united the Arabs to conquer all who refused to submit to their rule. The legends of Muhammad and the Rashidun can only be traced back to the mid-8th century during what would be called the Abbasid Revolution, starting around AD 750. But most classical sources for the Rashidun period are dated from the mid-9th century. I suspect that many of the oral traditions started as Abbasids' propaganda, and in the 9th century these legends were written down by a generation who genuinely believed they were true history. Abu al-Abbas was successful in gaining support from genuine followers of Muhammad, those who were pious holy men, who were critical of any ruler heretical to the faith, and supportive of any who spoke of overturning such rulers to renew the golden age of peace and devotion to Allah. The common people who wanted the peace and rest they knew from the Qur'an would follow a movement who had the support of the pious religious men. However, the immoral ends justify the means approach, which is abominable to God but commonly used by the ruthless men of history, had the pious turn a blind eye to the ruthlessness of the leader of this movement. Abu al-Abbas gained the momentum he needed to launch his revolution. Using what we would call Islamic extremism, he became known as al-Safa, the bloodshedder, appealing to all who were in any way disgruntled as a form of unity, including the Shia, a fanatical group who claimed ruling authority based on the bloodline back to the Prophet via Ali's descendants. Abu al-Abbas al-Safa successfully overthrew the Umayyads in 749-750 and ordered the extermination of the entire Umayyad clan to secure his power. The only known survivor of the dynasty was Abd al-Rahman, who escaped to Spain. His rule lasted until his death in 754, but the dynasty continued in some capacity until 1258, when the Mongols destroyed Baghdad. Why is it that Abu al-Abbas, the bloodshedder, came out of Khorasan, the modern-day region in the general vicinity of Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, a remote place further east of Baghdad? Then Baghdad is from Yathrib? The tradition claims he was related to Muhammad's uncle Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib. Of course, we only know of these names by the traditions written under the reign of the Abbasids. This summary is not to say the history of Islam is ungodly, contrasting it with some fairy tale history of Christian Europe. Evil men seize power in every age of history, and even good men who rise to power are affected by corruption. The only difference is that in the West, the power was with pagan Rome, and the Christians had no earthly power for the first 300 years. Then Rome took hold of Christianity as a tool, useful due to its popularity, to manipulate the masses and harness unity for worldly power. But the seat of military power in the East was formed immediately after the death of Muhammad, and used with the same effectiveness as did Rome. The concept of a successor to the Prophet is a central claim to the legitimacy of the caliphs and the never-ending struggle between Sunni and Shia Islam. But what does it really mean to claim to be successor to the Prophet of God? Do prophets pass on their prophethood, or does God choose whom he wills? It's generally understood that Muhammad was considered the last prophet. Why was there even a suggestion of a successor? And yet, many of the early caliphs were assassinated by rival sectarian forces struggling for power, and the schism between Shia and Sunni Muslims that also relates to the question of family versus companion claims to succession. All such claims clearly relate to the succession of power, not piety or prophethood. Why was it that Muhammad did not name a successor? Could it be that it's not in the nature of holy prophets to do as kings do and name a successor to his throne? Warlords fight for power, warlords create dynasties, and warlords who take power get to write the history. How do we know about the life of Muhammad? The earliest biography of Muhammad was written by Ibn Ishaq, a devout Muslim scholar of the 8th century. He is credited with collecting oral traditions about the Prophet's life. Ibn Ishaq moved from Egypt to Baghdad during the rule of Abu al-Abbas al-Safa and found patrons within the Abbasid political establishment. It was in this context that he allegedly wrote The Life of the Prophet, al-Sirah al-Nabawiyya, which I will refer to as the Sirah. He died in 767, over 120 years after Muhammad's death. However, we do not have Ibn Ishaq's work directly. Instead, we know of it because al-Bukhari, in the 9th century, cited Ibn Ishaq in his transmission chain. Even this is not preserved in its original form, as it only reached us through a student of al-Bukhari named Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham's Sirat Rasul Allah, The Life of God's Messenger, written nearly 200 years after Muhammad's death, is our primary source for the Sirah. Ibn Hisham openly admitted that he heavily redacted the original work, removing content he deemed inappropriate. He stated, "I have omitted things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people, and such reports as al-Bukhari told me he could not accept as trustworthy." This raises a troubling question. Could Ibn Ishaq himself have been a literary device used by al-Bukhari to compile various hadith from Abbasid traditions? If so, the Sirah would be less a historical record and more a political tool designed to justify the Abbasid Caliphate's rule. Adding to this uncertainty, Ibn Hisham's Sirah survives in two divergent versions, each reflecting ongoing redactions and recensions over centuries. A third transmission comes from al-Tabari, who heavily quoted the Sirah in his History of the Prophets and Kings in the 10th century. What we have, therefore, is not an original account, but a redaction of a redaction, shaped by the political needs of successive caliphates. Building of legendary narrations initially constructed during a period when Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, the bloodshedder, was the patron of Ibn Ishaq and needed political propaganda to motivate a rebellion to seize power from the Umayyads. These legends were then further embellished during latter periods when Muhammad was being venerated in ways that would be called worship if that was not blasphemous. The historical Muhammad, then, may be buried beneath layers of legend, constructed and reconstructed to serve changing political narratives. The Abbasid Caliphate and the Golden Age Baghdad, founded along the Tigris River, became a central hub for trade, connecting North Africa, Europe, China, and India. By the late 8th century, the city housed the great Bait al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, where scholars translated works of ancient philosophy and science into Arabic, fostering a golden age of learning. It was in this intellectual climate that Islamic scholars such as Ibn Ishaq, al-Bukhari, and al-Tabari compiled the foundational texts of Islam. Could it be that the history we have was crafted as Abbasid propaganda, designed to unify a vast and diverse empire under a shared mythology? The Abbasid historians had a clear motive: to justify the ruthlessness of their founder, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, the bloodshedder. Legends of Muhammad's military campaigns and the jihad of the four rightly guided caliphs painted early Islamic history as a divinely sanctioned conquest. This narrative helped the Abbasids solidify their rule by creating the belief that their methods of governance followed the Sunnah way of Muhammad and his companions. The historical evidence suggests an alternative interpretation. After Muhammad's death, warlords saw an opportunity to unify Arabia and launch conquests northward. The golden age of the rightly guided caliphs may have been a later fabrication designed to retrospectively legitimize the Abbasid Empire's methods of expansion and control. This perspective allows us to separate the Qur'an from later traditions and to reconsider Muhammad not as a warlord, but as a pious preacher. The prophet and his successors Muhammad was a peaceful prophet, a holy man who did not condone violence. He preached monotheism in Mecca for 12 years, gaining only 150 followers. His message, however, reached the nomadic tribes participating in the Hajj, the pagan pilgrimage to the Kaaba. By denouncing these practices, he made powerful enemies among the Quraysh. Learning of a plot to assassinate him, Muhammad migrated with his followers to Yathrib, later Medina, where his influence grew. In Yathrib, Bedouins and villagers from various tribes reconciled under Muhammad's monotheistic message. He also preached to the Jewish tribes, calling them to reject the traditions of the Talmud and embrace the entirety of God's revelation. After 10 years in Yathrib, Muhammad died. At his death, thousands came to mourn. None could have anticipated the political upheaval that would follow. The Quraysh of Mecca, Muhammad's own tribe, seized the moment and declared the political succession of the Prophet. If the Prophet's companions elected a successor of the religiously faithful, it did not have the momentum or influence or power of a warlord. The Quraysh promised booty and power, forming an army to raid every city in Arabia until all submitted to the religion of the Prophet as the unifying mascot. They then moved north, raiding every settlement and meeting every resistance on the battlefield. Submission was joining forces. The only other alternative offered was death. They are surprised by their success. The Persian and Byzantine Roman empires they knew of by great legends fell at their feet. The battle cry was Allah Akbar, our God is greater. This is a plausible alternative interpretation of history. The pious followers of Muhammad were among the Arabs, but they were not the military leaders. The Arabs knew of Muhammad, the prophet of God, and attributed their success to God, just as the Crusaders attributed their success to God. But neither were really honoring God in what they did to their neighbors. The pious Muslims carried the Qur'an in their hearts and migrated to teach and preach rightly according to the will of God. But those who craved political power used religion as a tool along with the sword to enforce their will and gain power. The autobiographical history of every empire is written to honor the founding fathers and to the benefit and patronage of the current ruling class. For Islam, the history of the empire was the story of Muhammad written under the Abbasid Caliphate. With this backdrop, we are able to find justification to set aside the prejudicial medieval traditions of men that overruled the word of God and directed Islam away from the Messiah the Qur'an affirmed. Let us hold fast to the Qur'an and reject traditions written centuries after the last ayah was revealed, even if it means acknowledging that we know little of Muhammad beyond what God chose to reveal in his word. Join me next time when we read from Chapter 2, Being Inspired by God, Part 1, The Word of God in the Qur'an. Until then, may the grace and the peace of the Lord be with you.